celebrate the development, while others are accusing the U.S.
In a shocking and unprecedented turn of events, the world finds itself on the edge of a new and terrifying conflict. Just moments ago, Venezuela launched a series of 50 missiles targeting a U.S. Navy destroyer in what is being called the largest naval battle in decades. The attack, which took place in the heart of the Caribbean Sea, has left the international community in disbelief. No one saw this coming. Not the U.S. military, not the Venezuelan government, and certainly not the countless global observers who had been watching the tense situation unfold between these two nations. But what led to this terrifying escalation? How did relations between Venezuela and the United States deteriorate to the point where missiles were fired? And what does this mean for the future of global security? Today, we'll dive deep into the chain of events that led to this catastrophic moment, the history behind the Venezuela-US conflict, and the potentially devastating consequences that are unfolding as we speak. Stay tuned as we break down the details of what is being called the most significant military engagement between the U.S. and a foreign power in over 30 years. With world leaders calling for emergency meetings and the threat of further military action looming, this is a story you can't afford to miss. What will happen next? Is the world on the brink of war? Stay with us to find out. The world has just witnessed a shocking and unexpected escalation of tensions between two powerful nations. On the morning of February 5, 2026, Venezuela launched a coordinated missile strike on the U.S. Navy's flagship destroyer, the USS Roosevelt, stationed off the coast of the Caribbean. This marks the largest military confrontation in decades between the United States and a foreign power, with immediate global ramifications. While this event has dominated news cycles, the series of incidents leading up to this attack reveal a complex and volatile geopolitical landscape, one that has been brewing for years. The roots of this conflict lie deep within the history of U.S.-Venezuelan relations, which have long been fraught with tension. For years, Venezuela has accused the United States of attempting to undermine its sovereignty, particularly after the U.S. imposed a series of sanctions in the early 2000s aimed at destabilizing the government of President Nicolas Maduro. These sanctions, aimed at crippling Venezuela's oil industry, were seen by the Venezuelan government as a direct attack on the country's most vital economic resource. But the tensions escalated further in the wake of the 2020 U.S. presidential election, when the Trump administration's hardline policies towards Latin America became more aggressive. Venezuela responded by seeking closer ties with adversaries of the U.S., including Russia, China, and Iran. Over the last few years, military cooperation between Venezuela and these nations grew, with Russian arms shipments, Chinese technological investments, and even Iranian military advisors operating on Venezuelan soil. Despite this, the relationship between Venezuela and the United States seemed to settle into a tense but stable standoff, until recently. In late January 2026, a mysterious military incursion occurred in the disputed waters off the Venezuelan coast, with reports of a U.S. submarine appearing near the Venezuelan oil rigs. Venezuela immediately denounced this act as a provocation, claiming that the submarine was not only trespassing in their exclusive economic zone, but also engaging in intelligence-gathering operations aimed at undermining Venezuela's national security. The United States, on the other hand, denied the allegations, citing its right to operate freely in international waters and accusing Venezuela of exaggerating the situation. Despite the war of words, the U.S. Navy deployed a task force to monitor the region, and tensions began to rise. Venezuela, viewing this as an escalating threat to its sovereignty, increased its military presence along the coast, conducting regular military exercises and deploying advanced missile systems to its key naval bases. In early February, a Venezuelan military spokesperson announced the successful testing of a new missile defense system, a direct response to what they termed the growing imperialism of the United States in Latin America. While all of this seemed like typical geopolitical posturing, things took a dramatic turn when a U.S. Navy destroyer, the USS Roosevelt, entered Venezuelan waters on February 4, 2026. The destroyer, reportedly engaged in routine patrol operations, was surrounded by Venezuelan warships and air defenses, sparking a series of tense confrontations. The U.S. vessel's crew was warned multiple times by Venezuelan forces to leave the area, but the destroyer remained in place, arguing that it was simply performing its duty in international waters. By the morning of February 5th, the situation had reached a breaking point. Venezuela's military, claiming that the U.S. destroyer was preparing for a hostile maneuver, launched a series of 50 missiles aimed at the ship, each carrying a payload designed to destroy naval vessels. The missiles struck the USS Roosevelt in a coordinated assault, causing significant damage to the ship and injuring several crew members. In response, the U.S. military quickly declared a state of emergency and launched airstrikes on Venezuelan coastal positions. The international community has been left in shock, with many analysts arguing that this attack could mark the beginning of a new Cold War between the U.S. and Venezuela, with wider implications for the global balance of power. Venezuela, emboldened by its military ties with Russia and China, may now feel it has the support needed to challenge U.S. dominance in the region. Meanwhile, the United States faces increasing pressure to respond decisively, but with the threat of Russian and Chinese involvement, many are wondering if a full-scale military conflict could be on the horizon. As this crisis continues to unfold, it is clear that the attack on the USS Roosevelt is not just the culmination of a few isolated incidents, but rather the latest chapter in a long-standing and increasingly dangerous geopolitical struggle. The consequences of this escalation will be felt far beyond the Caribbean Sea, with the potential to shape international relations for years to come. The escalating conflict between the United States and Venezuela did not happen overnight. In fact, the series of events leading to the missile strike on the USS Roosevelt on February 5, 2026, is the culmination of years of geopolitical tensions, economic warfare, and military maneuvers. The roots of this conflict stretch back to the early 2000s, when the Venezuelan government, under President Hugo Chavez, began to challenge U.S. dominance in Latin America. Chavez's socialist policies, as well as his outspoken criticism of U.S. foreign policy, particularly its involvement in Iraq and the War on Terror, put him at odds with Washington. The U.S. responded with sanctions and covert operations aimed at destabilizing his government. These actions set the stage for a deepening mistrust between the two nations, one that would persist long after Chavez's death in 2013. In the years following Chavez's death, his successor Nicolas Maduro took power, and relations between Venezuela and the United States continued to deteriorate. The U.S. imposed additional sanctions on Venezuela, particularly targeting its oil industry, which was the lifeblood of the country's economy. These sanctions, which were designed to cripple the Venezuelan economy and force regime change, had devastating effects. Hyperinflation, food shortages, and a collapse in public services created widespread unrest in Venezuela, which in turn fueled anti-U.S. sentiment among the Venezuelan people. By 2019, the U.S. had recognized opposition leader Juan Guaidó as the legitimate president of Venezuela, further straining relations with Maduro's government. The situation took a dramatic turn in 2021, when after years of economic decline, Venezuela reached out to Russia and China for support. Russia, eager to challenge U.S. influence in Latin America, began to supply Venezuela with advanced military equipment, including air defense systems, fighter jets, and surface-to-air missiles. China, seeking to expand its economic footprint in the region, began to provide Venezuela with loans and investments aimed at revitalizing its oil industry. This strategic alliance created a new power bloc in Latin America, one that directly challenged U.S. interests in the region. In 2024, the situation escalated further when a series of maritime confrontations took place between U.S. and Venezuelan naval forces. Venezuela's military, emboldened by its new alliances, began conducting more aggressive naval exercises near U.S.-controlled territories, such as Puerto Rico and the U.S. Virgin Islands. The U.S. Navy responded by increasing its presence in the region, sending aircraft carriers and destroyers to monitor the Venezuelan actions. The two nations found themselves in a standoff, with both sides claiming that the other was engaging in provocative military maneuvers. By mid-2025, tensions reached a breaking point. Venezuela, now more confident in its military capabilities, began deploying advanced missile defense systems along its coastline. These systems were developed with the help of Russian engineers, and their presence sent a clear signal to the U.S. that Venezuela was no longer willing to tolerate U.S. military presence in the region. In response, the U.S. began conducting frequent reconnaissance flights over Venezuela, further inflaming tensions. These flights were often described by Venezuelan officials as acts of espionage and provocation. The direct cause of the missile strike on the USS Roosevelt began in the final weeks of January 2026, when a U.S. Navy destroyer was spotted in Venezuelan waters. The destroyer, part of a routine U.S. military operation, was monitoring Venezuela's newly expanded naval exercises. Venezuela, perceiving this as a direct challenge to its sovereignty, issued multiple warnings to the U.S. Navy to leave its territorial waters. However, the USS Roosevelt did not retreat, and this refusal only served to further escalate the situation. Venezuelan officials, who were already on high alert, viewed the U.S. presence as a hostile maneuver and began preparing for a military response. In the days leading up to the attack, Venezuela made it clear that it would not tolerate any further U.S. provocations. Military units were put on standby, and there were reports that Venezuela had positioned several advanced missile systems along its northern coast, aimed directly at U.S. naval vessels operating in the region. The Venezuelan leadership, under the guidance of President Maduro, made it clear that any further incursions would be met with force. The U.S., despite its knowledge of Venezuela's military preparations, continued its operations, underestimating the seriousness of the Venezuelan threat. By February 5th, the situation had reached a boiling point. Venezuela launched a barrage of 50 missiles at the USS Roosevelt, each designed to target the destroyer's vulnerable sections, including its propulsion systems and weapons platforms. The attack caught the U.S. Navy off guard, causing significant damage to the vessel and leading to multiple casualties among the crew. The Venezuelan government, in a statement, declared that the attack was a direct response to U.S. military aggression in its waters and would serve as a warning to other foreign powers operating in the region. This act of military aggression, though shocking, is part of a broader narrative of escalating tensions between the U.S. and Venezuela, fueled by economic sanctions, military posturing, and a growing geopolitical divide. The missile attack on the USS Roosevelt represents not just a direct challenge to U.S. military might, but a significant shift in the power dynamics of the Western Hemisphere. The attack on the USS Roosevelt has triggered a wave of reactions from across the globe, with various countries and international organizations scrambling to respond to the unprecedented escalation between Venezuela and the United States. What was once a regional conflict now has the potential to spiral into a full-blown international crisis, with dire consequences for global peace and security. In the hours following the missile strike, both Venezuela and the United States made public statements justifying their actions. The Venezuelan government, under President Nicolas Maduro, framed the attack as a necessary defense of the nation's sovereignty and territorial integrity. Maduro addressed the nation, declaring that the U.S. Navy's continued presence in Venezuelan waters was an act of war, and that the missile strike was a response to years of U.S. provocation. He expressed his country's determination to defend itself, no matter the cost, and called for unity among Venezuelans in the face of external threats. "We will not allow foreign forces to dictate our future," he proclaimed, underscoring Venezuela's growing ties with Russia, China, and Iran. Maduro's rhetoric was filled with defiance, and he promised more retaliatory actions if U.S. forces continued to operate in the region. On the other hand, the United States government condemned the attack in the strongest possible terms, labeling it an unprovoked act of aggression. U.S. President James Harper addressed the nation from the Oval Office, assuring the American people that the attack would not go unanswered. "Venezuela's reckless actions have jeopardized the safety of our sailors and tested the resolve of our military," he stated. President Harper called for an immediate emergency session of the United Nations Security Council and pledged to increase military presence in the region. He made it clear that the U.S. would do everything necessary to protect its forces, including escalating military operations if required. The Pentagon quickly mobilized additional naval assets, sending 2 more aircraft carriers and several attack submarines to the Caribbean. A number of U.S. military officials, however, privately questioned the wisdom of further escalation, fearing that the situation could spiral out of control and involve Russia or China directly. In the immediate aftermath of the missile strike, the international community was divided in its response. The United Nations convened an emergency meeting, but the Security Council was deadlocked. The Russian Federation, a staunch ally of Venezuela, strongly condemned the U.S. actions, accusing Washington of provoking the crisis. Russia's Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov issued a statement calling for the immediate withdrawal of U.S. military forces from the region, claiming that the U.S. was using Venezuela as a pretext for military intervention. The Russian government also expressed its support for Venezuela's right to defend itself, and hinted that Russia would be prepared to offer further military assistance to its ally if the situation escalated further. "We stand with our Venezuelan partners in their fight against imperialist aggression," Lavrov said, underscoring the growing geopolitical divide between the West and Russia. Meanwhile, China, which has deep economic and political ties with Venezuela, issued a more cautious statement, calling for calm and urging both sides to engage in dialogue. However, China also made it clear that it would not tolerate any further U.S. actions that it viewed as attempts to destabilize Venezuela. Analysts believe that China's response was calculated, seeking to avoid direct confrontation while asserting its influence in the region. Beijing has made significant investments in Venezuela's oil industry, and any further escalation would put these interests at risk. At the same time, China is wary of U.S. military moves in Latin America, viewing them as a direct challenge to its own growing influence in the Western Hemisphere. The Chinese government has not ruled out military support for Venezuela if it is pushed into a corner, but for now, it appears to be focused on diplomatic pressure. In stark contrast, the European Union expressed deep concern over the escalation and called for restraint from both sides. The EU issued a joint statement condemning the missile strike on the USS Roosevelt and urging Venezuela to de-escalate the situation. European leaders emphasized the need for dialogue and a peaceful resolution to the crisis, warning that further violence would only lead to more instability in the region. While many European nations share concerns about Venezuela's authoritarian regime, they are also wary of U.S. interventionism in Latin America. European diplomats have called for an urgent diplomatic initiative to prevent the situation from spiraling into a larger conflict. On the ground in Venezuela, the military's response has been one of heightened readiness. The Venezuelan armed forces, which have been receiving significant training and equipment from Russia in recent years, are now on high alert, preparing for the possibility of U.S. reprisals. The Venezuelan Ministry of Defense has issued statements suggesting that the military is fully capable of defending the country's borders and is prepared for further confrontations if necessary. While the Venezuelan military's capabilities are not on par with the U.S. Navy, they are well equipped with advanced air defense systems, anti-ship missiles, and drones that could complicate any American military intervention. Analysts speculate that Venezuela may attempt to use asymmetric warfare tactics, including cyber attacks, irregular forces, and sabotage operations against U.S. military installations in the region. As the situation unfolds, there are growing fears that the conflict could spill over into neighboring countries, particularly Colombia, which has long been an ally of the United States. Colombian officials have expressed alarm at the possibility of Venezuelan forces conducting cross-border operations, including the deployment of irregular militias into Colombian territory. The Colombian government has raised the alert level along its border with Venezuela, and U.S. forces are reportedly coordinating with Colombian authorities to monitor potential threats. Meanwhile, other Latin American countries have been caught in the middle, with some expressing support for Venezuela's right to defend itself, while others warn against further escalation that could destabilize the entire region. The global impact of the conflict cannot be underestimated. The U.S. Navy's presence in the Caribbean Sea is strategically vital for global trade and the flow of oil, particularly through the Panama Canal. An extended conflict between the U.S. and Venezuela could disrupt these shipping routes, leading to a sharp increase in global oil prices. Moreover, the growing military tension in the region could spark an arms race, with other nations in Latin America and the Caribbean seeking to bolster their own military capabilities in response to the perceived threat from both the U.S. and Venezuela. The situation could also encourage other global powers to take sides, further polarizing international relations and potentially setting the stage for a larger regional conflict. As the world watches, the attack on the USS Roosevelt has become a flashpoint, one that could alter the course of history. What began as a localized dispute between two nations has now become a broader geopolitical struggle with the potential to reshape global alliances, economic relationships, and military strategies. The coming days will be critical in determining whether diplomacy can prevail or whether the world is on the verge of witnessing a new Cold War, or even a military conflict in the Western Hemisphere. The stakes have never been higher. As the dust begins to settle after the missile strike on the USS Roosevelt, the world stands at a critical juncture. The incident, which marks a dangerous escalation in the long-running tension between Venezuela and the United States, has left global leaders scrambling to determine the next steps. With military forces on high alert and diplomatic channels buzzing with activity, the future of international relations hinges on how the conflict is managed in the coming weeks and months. The immediate response from the U.S. has been one of forceful retaliation. Following the attack, President James Harper ordered the Pentagon to increase its military presence in the Caribbean, deploying additional aircraft carriers and submarines to the region. The U.S. has vowed to protect its military personnel and ensure the security of vital shipping lanes in the region. The Pentagon's response, while swift, has been carefully calculated to avoid further escalation into a broader war. Analysts, however, are worried that the U.S. might be walking a fine line. Any further provocation could trigger a response not just from Venezuela, but from its allies, particularly Russia and China, both of whom have shown growing support for Maduro's regime. Military strategists fear that the continued presence of U.S. forces near Venezuelan borders could prompt the Venezuelan government to view any additional military actions as a justification for even more drastic measures, including the use of unconventional tactics such as cyber attacks or irregular warfare. On the other hand, the Venezuelan leadership remains resolute. Maduro's government has made it clear that the attack on the USS Roosevelt was not an isolated incident, but part of a larger strategy to defend the country's sovereignty against perceived imperialist aggression. The Venezuelan government, despite the heavy toll the country has endured due to sanctions and economic hardships, has found an ally in Russia, which has pledged its support for Venezuela in the event of further U.S. military action. Moscow has already begun to increase its military presence in the region, with reports of Russian naval vessels being deployed to the Caribbean. While not openly engaging in combat, Russia has made it clear that it will not tolerate what it views as a U.S. encroachment on Latin American sovereignty. As the standoff continues, the wider implications for global security are becoming increasingly evident. The U.S. military's presence in the Caribbean and the Gulf of Mexico plays a pivotal role in maintaining the flow of global trade, particularly oil shipments through the Panama Canal.